Ladies and gentlemen, there's something unsettling that happens when you begin to truly heal. Not just survive, but actively confront your pain, change your patterns, and step into a higher version of yourself. The people around you don't always celebrate it. In fact, some begin to pull away. Others mock you, question you, or quietly grow cold. You might expect healing to bring support and applause, but what you often find instead is resistance, sometimes even hate. And the hardest part is realizing that this reaction doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones who knew you best when you were broken. That's because healing is disruptive. It forces people to confront things they've buried, wounds they've normalized, choices they've justified, comfort zones they've disguised as personality. When you change, it destabilizes the emotional contracts others had with you. Maybe they needed you weak to feel needed themselves. Maybe your silence kept the peace. Maybe your insecurity made them feel superior. But now, you're shifting. You're setting boundaries. You're learning to say no, to speak up, to leave situations that once defined you. And that threatens the balance they had grown comfortable with. So they push back, not always aggressively, but subtly, through sarcasm, distance, gossip, dismissive comments, not because your healing is wrong, but because it reminds them of everything they've avoided within themselves. You didn't become arrogant, you became self-aware. You didn't abandon them, you just stopped abandoning yourself. And that shift, quiet, necessary, and deeply personal, is sometimes enough to make people feel like you're the enemy. But you're not. You're just changing. And change, real change, always reveals who's genuinely with you and who is just comfortable with your wounds. The path of healing isn't only about becoming whole. It's also about learning to walk alone when necessary. Because healing is clarity. And clarity doesn't just change how you see yourself. It changes how you see everyone around you. When you embark on the journey of healing, you're not just mending your own heart. You're shaking the very foundations of those around you who have grown comfortable in their inertia. Your transformation is a stark reminder that change is possible. And that can be a frightening prospect for people who have long allowed themselves to remain stuck. When you take responsibility for your pain, challenge your limiting beliefs, and start to rebuild yourself, you become a living testament to the possibility of change. And for many, that possibility is a mirror reflecting the very stagnation they haven't dared to confront. It's a hard truth, but one that reveals a great deal about human nature. Many people are afraid of what healing represents because it implies a movement away from old habits and fixed narratives. In their world, life is static, a series of predictable roles and expectations. When you break out of that mold, when your story evolves from one of victimhood to one of self-empowerment, it questions the unspoken agreements that have allowed everyone else to remain in a state of complacency. Your progress becomes a subtle indictment of their inability to change. A reminder that they are clinging to patterns that may no longer serve them. Psychologically, this response is rooted in what can be called the fear of the unknown. Change is inherently uncomfortable because it exposes vulnerabilities, both yours and theirs. While you are busy confronting your own imperfections, others might prefer to bury their insecurities rather than acknowledge them. Your healing, therefore, can trigger a defensive reaction. It forces them to face their own wounds, their unsaid regrets, and the parts of themselves they've chosen to ignore. That confrontation is unsettling, and instead of dealing with it, many resort to rejection or even hostility. They mask their discomfort with disdain, projecting their internal struggle outward by devaluing your progress. On a philosophical level, this dynamic speaks to a deeper societal reluctance to embrace impermanence and personal evolution. The idea that you can heal implies that you can change, and change disrupts the status quo. For those who thrive on routine, on the predictable ebb and flow of familiar patterns, the very act of personal growth is a radical event. It challenges not only their worldview, but also the delicate power balances that have been built on collective inaction. In a sense, your healing is an act of rebellion, a quiet uprising against a system that prizes stability over evolution. And in doing so, you inadvertently force others to reckon with the possibility that they too can step outside the confines of their known limitations. In my own experience, I've seen friends and colleagues react to transformation with a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. When someone starts to set boundaries, to challenge outdated beliefs, or to simply choose self-care over the familiar chaos of their past, it often leaves others feeling exposed. They may feel that their own inability to change is suddenly on display, and that is perhaps the most painful realization of all. It's not that your journey is inherently antagonistic. Rather, it shines a spotlight on the aspects of themselves they've long ignored or denied, and that spotlight can be blinding. It disrupts the comfortable narrative that life should remain unchallenged, unaltered, unchanged. The irony is that while you are healing, the very people who might have once rallied around you now stand back, distancing themselves emotionally. They might even start to criticize your choices or label your new behaviors as selfish or ungrateful. In essence, your progress becomes a thorn in their side. It's easier for them to cling to their old ways, to preserve the familiar, to confront their own need for transformation. This resistance is not a reflection of your path, but rather a mirror of their own internal battles, a reluctance to disrupt the quiet inertia of their daily lives. But remember, you have nothing to apologize for. Your healing is not a threat. It's a beacon. It signals to those who are ready that change is possible, that growth is attainable, and that life doesn't have to be a series of repeated mistakes. You are charting a course that, while perhaps uncomfortable for others, is necessary for your own survival and flourishing. You might not win universal approval, but you will inspire those willing to look beyond their fears. So as you continue on this path, let the resistance you face serve as a reminder that your work is important. Embrace the fact that your healing is powerful enough to unsettle the status quo. Keep moving forward with authenticity and courage, and know that every step you take not only repairs your own soul, but also carves out space for others to find their own strength. Remember this, your healing is not just for you. It is a call to evolution for everyone who dares to witness it. When you begin to heal, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. You begin to change the emotional contracts people had with you. Not because you're trying to hurt anyone, but because healing naturally alters the roles you once played. You start speaking more honestly. You stop agreeing to things that drain you. You no longer pretend to be okay just to keep someone else comfortable. And that shift, though deeply necessary for your growth, can feel like betrayal to those who depended on your brokenness to keep the dynamic intact. We often underestimate how much our relationships, whether with friends, family, or partners, are structured around unspoken agreements. Maybe you were the one who never said no, who always made yourself smaller to avoid conflict. Maybe you absorbed emotional chaos so others wouldn't have to face their own. Maybe you accepted treatment that didn't respect your worth, because at the time, you weren't sure you had any. But healing forces those dynamics into the light. It demands honesty. And that honesty threatens the foundation some people were standing on. When you grow, you stop playing roles that no longer align with your values. You no longer enable dysfunction just to keep peace. You start calling things what they are. You begin to protect your energy, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And the people who benefited from your silence or self-abandonment will not always take that well. They may call you selfish. They may accuse you of changing in ways they don't like. But what they're really saying is, you're not who I need you to be in order for me to stay comfortable. Psychologically, people form identities not just individually, but relationally, meaning they see themselves through their relationship with you. If you were always the helper, the fixer, or the one who tolerated mistreatment, that role made them feel safe. Your willingness to stay small allowed them to feel large. Your lack of boundaries let them escape accountability. And now that you're healing, that safety net is gone. That version of you is gone. And it leaves them with a sense of loss, even if what they lost was the ability to take you for granted. It's crucial to understand that not all conflict comes from malice. Some of it comes from fear. When people lash out at your growth, they're not always trying to control you out of cruelty. They're often afraid that your evolution means they'll be left behind. They sense that you're rising into a version of yourself that no longer needs the same dynamics. And that fear of abandonment or irrelevance surfaces as anger, sarcasm, or guilt tripping. It's emotional regression. a desperate attempt to pull you back to who you were so they don't have to face who they haven't become. And yet, your responsibility is not to keep shrinking for the sake of others' comfort. Your job isn't to make yourself relatable to someone who refuses to grow. That's not humility. That's self-sabotage. True healing requires that you outgrow certain roles, even when doing so comes at the cost of certain relationships. It's not about superiority. It's about alignment. And not everyone who started with you is meant to walk beside you in every season. Some people were only connected to your unhealed self. Once you start standing in your truth, they no longer recognize you, not because you've become fake, but because you've become whole. This transition isn't easy. There will be grief, there will be loneliness, but there will also be clarity. The people who are meant to be in your life will adapt with you, not against you. They'll celebrate your boundaries, not punish them. They'll support your growth, even if it challenges their own. That's what healthy connection looks like. Mutual respect, evolving together, not holding each other hostage in outdated roles. And this is what healing ultimately demands, the courage to disrupt the familiar for the sake of becoming authentic. It demands that you choose truth over attachment, even when that truth feels isolating. It demands that you accept being misunderstood by those who only ever related to your wounds. And that, more than anything, is where real transformation begins. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. If your healing disrupts the roles others once assigned you, let it. Let it shake the foundations that kept you small. Because the people who truly value you will adjust to your growth. The rest were only ever loyal to your pain. There's a truth most people don't like to admit out loud, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Some people liked you better when you were broken. Not because they're evil, not because they consciously wanted you to suffer, but because your pain made them feel powerful. Your uncertainty, your self-doubt, your dependence. It gave them a sense of control. It allowed them to play the role of the rescuer, the advisor, the one who always had the upper hand. And when you started to heal, when you began to stand on your own, it quietly disrupted that imbalance. Suddenly, they weren't needed in the same way. Suddenly, you didn't rely on them to validate your decisions or hold your emotional world together. And that shift didn't just confuse them, it exposed them. There's a deeply psychological mechanism at work here. In dysfunctional dynamics, people unconsciously anchor their sense of identity to someone else's weakness. Your low self-worth allowed them to feel elevated. Your chaos gave them purpose. Your silence made space for their dominance. So when you began to regain clarity, when you started making choices from a place of self-respect instead of self-protection, they lost something. Not something tangible, but something more subtle, the emotional leverage they once had. It's uncomfortable to face, but many relationships are built on unspoken hierarchies. And when you start to challenge that structure by healing, by growing, by setting boundaries, you change the emotional terrain. The rules shift. You begin saying no where you used to say yes. You begin asking for reciprocity where there was once only sacrifice. You no longer play small to protect their ego, and to someone who is quietly thriving off your imbalance, that feels like betrayal. Not because you did anything wrong, but because their false sense of superiority depended on your inability to rise. This dynamic is often hidden under the language of concern. They might say you've changed too much, that you're not the same anymore, or that you're becoming distant or selfish. But what they really mean is that they can no longer control the narrative. They can't place themselves above you because you've closed the emotional gap they used to exploit. And here's where the philosophy cuts deep. Healing is not just about you feeling better. It's about you becoming sovereign. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you handed over just to keep peace, just to feel safe, just to be loved. And that reclamation process, while necessary, is also lonely, because not everyone can walk with you into the next version of yourself. Especially those who are only ever comfortable with the wounded version of you. It's a strange grief to outgrow a relationship that was built on your own suppression. You might miss the closeness, the familiarity, the validation, but you cannot grieve your past and return to it at the same time. Healing asks you to let go, not out of cruelty, but out of commitment to what you're becoming. Some people will never say it out loud, but your empowerment terrifies them. Not because you've hurt them, but because your strength exposes their stagnation. When you stop needing permission to live authentically, when you stop apologizing for having boundaries, when you stop playing the broken role that made them feel whole, you create an existential discomfort in them, one that says, if they can change, maybe I should too. But change requires effort. It requires accountability. And not everyone is willing to meet themselves that honestly. So they turn to what's easier. They criticize you. They try to pull you back into the old script. They provoke, they guilt, they distance. Because it's easier to believe that you became arrogant than to believe they became complacent. It's easier to say you're the problem than to face their own refusal to grow. And you have to be strong enough, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, to see that for what it is. A reaction, not a reflection. Healing will always be misunderstood by those who are comfortable with your dysfunction. That's not a failure of your process. It's a sign that it's working. The more you rise, the more you will reveal who was genuinely with you and who was simply attached to the version of you that made them feel better about themselves. So hold your ground, continue becoming, and understand this. The people who can only love you when you're broken were never really loving you. They were loving the power they felt in comparison. Walk away from that dynamic. Don't shrink to preserve someone else's illusion. Because your healing is not just a return to self. It's a declaration that you no longer belong to anyone's shadow. And that is worth every misunderstanding. Healing is not a passive process. It doesn't happen simply with time. It requires effort, intense, often painful psychological work, and perhaps most importantly, it requires courage. Because to heal means to look directly at what's broken, to take responsibility for what you've accepted, tolerated, or even enabled, and then to do the hard work of becoming someone new. That's not something most people are willing to do. It's far easier to stay wounded and blame others for the bleeding. And so when you choose to heal, you're not just changing yourself. You're exposing a kind of cowardice in others. You're revealing, by contrast, that they too could have changed, but didn't. Courage in this sense isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward even when the fear is real, especially when the fear is internal. Healing forces you to confront parts of yourself that you've long disowned, the guilt, the shame, the self-deception. And most people avoid that confrontation because it dismantles the narrative that they've spent years protecting. They'd rather stay in a familiar pain than walk through the unfamiliar path of accountability. That's why so few truly change. Because real healing makes you take ownership, not just of what happened to you, but of how you've responded to it. So when you begin that journey, when you stop blaming and start building, it's not just admirable, it's threatening. It disturbs the social order of your relationships. It unsettles the collective comfort that comes from shared wounds and shared denial. And that's where the hate begins to creep in. It's not because you're doing harm, it's because your growth reveals their stagnation. Your courage makes their excuses feel smaller. Your clarity makes their confusion less tolerable. And instead of facing that, many would rather project their discomfort onto you. They say you've changed. They say you're too much now. But what they're really saying is, you're becoming someone I no longer have control over. This is why it's so important not to romanticize the healing process. It's not all self-love affirmations and peaceful journaling sessions. Sometimes it's alienation. Sometimes it's walking away from people who refuse to rise with you. Sometimes it's grieving not just the past, but the version of yourself who once tolerated it. And always, it's about facing the discomfort most people would do anything to avoid. Because once you begin healing, you lose the luxury of denial. You can't pretend anymore. You can't sit in rooms that make your soul shrink just to keep others at ease. You've seen too much of yourself, your real self, to keep playing small. This courage is what separates those who speak of change from those who live it. Because anyone can talk about growth. Anyone can post about mental health and self-worth and boundaries. But to actually live it, that requires choices that will make you misunderstood. That requires becoming someone whose truth disrupts the illusions others are desperate to maintain. And it requires the strength to stay grounded even when that truth costs you relationships, approval, or comfort. Courage, in this context, is also about consistency. Anyone can change for a week or a month, but real healing is about showing up for yourself over and over again, even when it's hard, even when the old patterns whisper to you, even when the people around you don't understand, especially then. Because your courage is not measured by how loudly you announce your healing. It's measured by how quietly you commit to it when no one's watching. And that quiet commitment becomes a kind of defiance, a defiance of the version of you that once settled, a defiance of the idea that trauma must define your future, a defiance of the culture of complaint where everyone stays stuck but points fingers outward. You stop blaming, you start building. You start pleasing, you start protecting your peace. And in doing so, you take your power back. Not as a performance, but as a practice. So yes, they may hate you. Not because you harmed them, but because you exposed their hesitation to change, because your courage unsettled their comfort. But that hate is not your burden to carry. Your job is not to shrink so others feel tall. Your job is to rise. And in doing so, to offer a silent invitation for others to do the same. Here's what I want you to remember. Your courage will isolate you before it empowers you. But don't confuse isolation with failure. Sometimes it's just the silence that comes before the truth finally echoes. Keep rising, keep healing, keep choosing the path most avoid, because the life you're building on the other side of your pain is worth every misunderstanding along the way. Healing is not just a personal journey, it's a radical act. It disrupts the lies you once told yourself to survive. It challenges the dynamics others relied on to feel secure. It forces change where comfort once ruled. And perhaps most painfully, it reveals who was truly with you and who was only loyal to your wounds. But this is not something to fear. It's something to honor. Because your healing, no matter how quiet, no matter how misunderstood, is a declaration of self-worth. It's proof that you refuse to be defined by the damage and chose instead to be shaped by resilience. You will be judged, you will be resented, but that's the cost of becoming someone who no longer fits the expectations that were built on your silence. And the reward? Freedom, clarity, strength. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that no longer needs to. The kind that holds its ground even when the crowd walks away. So don't shrink. Don't apologize for evolving. You're not responsible for the discomfort your growth reveals in others. You're responsible for your own truth, your own peace, your own future. And if that future demands solitude for a while, let it. If it demands walking away from people who loved your brokenness but cannot tolerate your wholeness, so be it. Because you're not here to be accepted by the past. You're here to create a future that aligns with who you're becoming. And that begins the moment you stop waiting for permission and start moving in the direction of your healing. No matter who tries to hold you back, walk on. You're not behind, you're ahead. You're not too much, you're finally enough for yourself. And in that there is power no hate can touch.